Hello there everybody! In this video I got a couple of tips and tricks for you regarding the Reaver faction in the new Empires and Ashes DLC for Age of Wonders 4. So I've been playing these guys a little bit, and my idea was to give you a really good impression about what these guys are really good at, how you can utilize that, and I hope this video will help you out. So first of all, let's get into the very first thing, and that is the Reaver faction has an insane benefit from marking their targets. So the mechanic here is called focused aggression, and every Reaver can pick up extra damage if he hits a marked target. Marking does, by default, nothing else than lowering the evasion. But with the Reavers, therefore, you have a damage steroid for your melee units, but also for your ranged units. So this faction is really good at ranged units because they are lowering the enemy's chance to dodge, and then they get up to 50% extra bonus damage for just whacking a target that's easy to hit. That is insane. The real problem and the real bummer behind all that is that the mage lock unit of the faction here is, in all honesty, a pretty weak and uninteresting example of a ranged unit. Their heavy mage lock has a really heavy wham, but it requires all three action points. So if they are in position, they can really wreak havoc, but in practice, often the battle is over around them when they got into position. They do pierce, though, to 50% of the enemy's defense. Therefore, their entirely physical focus will never be a big issue. But their biggest benefit is that they can mark enemies. So they can move up to the enemy, mark them, and fire next turn. That makes them, though, to the supporters of your other ranged units, and then they can fire the next turn. But in a nutshell, you really want to try and focus into a ranged unit potpourri if you want to play that style, because the mage locks can mark and after that they can hit, but when they mark something like a Houndmaster or any other Tome ranged unit or something you have captured with your Overseers, more about that later, is going to do the trick just fine. But you have to keep in mind that all the marking is not really powerful enough to kick your mage locks into a major position. They are just too clunky. You need something more mobile and agile in between it. If you don't want to play foreign ranged units, I would recommend at least some some heroes with ranged weapons, or you can also opt into battle mages pretty well, because evasion also acts as a counter thing against magic attacks, so your battle mages will also hit quite hard, and you have a spell which allows you to apply the Reaver racial thing, the focused aggression, on everybody in your roster, just like with any other culture. Now, let's move on over to number 2. I want to talk about the war dependency of this faction. They have war spoils as a unique resource. This is a really sick resource. You can do so many wonderful things with that. You can extort other free cities to give you resources for that. You can hire badass units like the mage cannon here. But most importantly, you have to keep in mind that war spoils are exclusively gained by waging war against either AI players or free cities. That means you are depending on war. You should therefore never kill off the independent city right next to your empire entirely, because you can basically milk them for war spoils. Or same applies to a AI enemy that you got under control. It pays off to just give them peace from time to time and just declare war on them later again, because the Reavers will never suffer any Imperium penalty for an unjustified war. That means they will never ever have any problems to just stab you in the back whenever it pays them any benefit. Therefore, you should never kill off your war parties in your vicinity, because you can do too many good things with war spoils. I'm going to talk later in point 6 about what, for example, is in it. Now, Number 3, I want to talk about the insane supporters of the Reaver faction. Overseers are just nuts. First of all, their marking blast is insane. It blinds the enemy, therefore you get free retaliation-free engages on the enemy. You cripple the enemy's ranged attacks with that, and they also mark with this. This is pretty nice. They can always open up for your relatively squishy infantry by just blinding the enemy you want to attack, and then you can send the own infantry in without getting a retaliation strike in. This is massive, but it comes even better when we look at subdue. A overseer can just subdue any immobilized unit, so they need to be immobilized, frozen, or stunned. And then the overseer and the subdued unit will just chill for the rest of the fight. This is pretty sick, because you can afterwards recruit these units if you have enough war spoils, that is, or you just chill with the fact that every overseer can just eliminate a unit if they are immobilized for a turn and you get them into range. Subdue is only a one action thing, so I don't know if this will stay like that or if it'll get nerfed. I somehow see that coming, but currently these guys are just insane, given the fact that they also can patch up singular units pretty decently. They are really one of the major backbones of the Reaver faction, and I'd really recommend to have at least one of these guys in every one of your banners. If you want to rely more on them, please be my guest, put more into them. That comes really to the point where they have an innate synergy with the Harrier units, which can toss nets and immobilize enemies. So they have a strong combo here with just the tier 1 skirmishes and the tier 2 overseers. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to talk with the next point about, I've already mentioned it a little bit, about flanking synergy. You not only have marking as a mechanic, you also get a really easy point into flanking enemies, because first of all, you can blind enemies, but your tier 3 units also have the distraction as a built-in mechanic, so you can always count on having an ability to flank your enemy, either by positioning your units just accordingly, because you have tier 1 skirmishers and tier 3 skirmishers, so you really have the tools to do so, or you just blast them with a distracting shot in the face. So feel free to pick up the flanking beneficial racial trait here, because your culture is really good at provoking flanking situations, either by positioning or by using the Dragoon skill, or you just pick something out of the tomes, because you can really get a lot of flanking into this faction for little to no effort. In the next point, number 5, I want to talk about the insanity that is the tier 1 roster of the Reavers. So I already spoke a little bit about the Harriers. You have a really strong ranged attack, or seriously 20 damage is a lot in the early game, and it does also immobilize and mark. Yeah, what can I say? The only downside is that it is on cooldown after you've used it, but these guys, they hit hard, they can prepare the combo hit for your overseers, but most importantly, already from turn 1 on, or from the very early game on, they allow you to pick up a single target that shall not move in a combat, and often this kind of control is enough to really mitigate a lot of losses, exert a lot of control on the battlefield, and these guys are so freaking powerful due to the fact that this net shot has a innate range of 4. This one is boosted. The other unit, the mercenary, is, well, I love these guys. So you have a regular melee attack and you have drive back. They can push a unit 1 hex back. They move alongside with that, so they take up the place where the unit was before. They are the perfect bodyguard for any ranged unit. You can just shove away the enemy that's blocking your ranged unit and then let the ranged unit attack. This is especially important for your mage lock units that are, like I already mentioned, really relying on their action points, but altogether The combination of being able to pin your enemies down and shove them around gives you so much tier 1 power that I really was laughing and brutalizing my enemies on brutal difficulty from the very beginning of the game with just these 2 units, because they're just that good. I'm really impressed of the punching power that you got. I do want to mention that due to the fact that these guys are mercenaries, they are a little bit more costly. Therefore, they scale really bad into the late game because they are too costly for being a tier 1 unit. You might want to replace them with different spear units later on, but drive back is a really strong attack overall. Now, next point, I want to talk about the tier 3 roster. You have 2 tier 3 units, which is amazing in itself. I want to talk about the Mage Lock Cannons first. They are only buildable with war spoils. Therefore, they are one of the most exclusive units in the game in a way, and they are also really badass. That's because they have a ranged attack which simply always hits. This is really nuts. It also fires in a 3-hex line, so you have to take care about friendly fire, but nevertheless, you have so rarely effects that just have a guaranteed hit, and with 30 damage, this is also nothing to sneeze at. Apart from that, they also function pretty decently as a siege unit, so that's also something really useful about them, but there's not much more special about them except for the fact that you should protect these units. They sport decent resistance values, but these are actually only the baseline for a tier 3 unit, so don't get yourself fooled by that. They are easy to pop and hard to replace. But if you have a couple of these and you attack a city, you will really notice how ridiculously easy it is to breach into a city, especially since these guys can damage fortifications. And they also remove defensive stances, and they're really worth the money. But at the same time, hard to replace if they ever get burst down. The other tier 3 unit I want to talk about is the Dragoon. Well, the Dragoon is really First of all, you get the Harrying Shot as an add-on to his already pretty powerful melee attack, which allows you to distract enemies, and you have again that sweet piercing effect, which means this shot will hurt against even heavily armored units, but it has a slight cooldown. But what's the real highlight about these guys is the Master Skirmisher trait. They get to retreat from the enemy after striking. Due to the fact that they are skirmishers, they can ignore the enemy's zone of control. They don't trigger enemies' opportunity attacks. That means they can go in, burst something down, and go out. Or they stand back and prepare an enemy to be better flanked down. In either way, they are really one of the best tier 3 units that I've seen in the entire game so far, because they have a spot where they can fit in at any point. They can either support from the back line, go all in, burst something down, or support somebody. There's just so much usability behind these. The only downside here, of course, is them being skirmishes means almost no armor. So very burst, very burst, susceptible to bursts. But with the decent amount of HP as a cavalry unit, it could be worse, but you should pay attention to repositioning them well to a point where they cannot be attacked by a large cluster of enemies at once, because they do pop like a ripe berry. Now, which brings me pretty much to the next point, number 7. You should really handle your squishiness across the game. One glaring weakness in this whole roster is the whole offensiveness. There's really only two defensive units, and that's your mercenary and your overseer. The rest is just all out attack, no defensive measures. So that means you really have to pay attention to either pick up tomes that make you sturdy as hell. Nature tomes come to mind, which would give you innate supporting abilities, or you just summon out of the tomes other units that do the tanking and the heavy lifting for you. Here again, nature tomes come to mind, or Materium is also a pretty solid candidate. Or you just use your overseers, and whenever something really nice comes by, you just snag them and you subdue them. Or you conquer a free city which sports a couple of really nice defensive units from other cultures. Either way, you really have to handle this problem, because otherwise you won't have any mid or late game, because you will be suffering severe losses quite often, because you will die quite often. I mean, you can also play it in the way that you have a stupidly high mana production and summon up whatever gets lost. It's also a pretty viable tactic. You just have to have your dispensables, expendable units. Either way, you have to have a strategy though for this problem. Now, number 8 is about another deficiency. Your culture is really bad at producing food. You have no innate boosters, and your culture doesn't have any innate boosters for knowledge. So these two metrics are something you should keep under control, either by, like I did here, forcing a lot of provinces going into science production, or you just pick up a cultural trait like I did here with the ritual cannibals. I can really strongly recommend that, because the corpse eating ability is also a soft support for every one of your units, which counteracts your squishiness quite well again. But the most important part is you gain food and mana for every victory, and since you are a war-faring species, you totally dominate with this trait, and you get a lot of bang for your buck there, especially since it speeds up the city development whenever you fight. I really like that one for this problem. But either way, find a solution to get your cities growing, otherwise you will end up with a really low economy backbone there. And like I said, knowledge is always important, and your culture has no specific benefits in that regard, so you should really focus that. Now, number 9, you really, really, really dominate in the early game. I already mentioned what I did with just these tier 1 units, and if you add in a couple of dominant early tomes, like Tome of the Horde or anything else that just adds in some more expendable units or some more crowd control, it's a really powerful pick also to go for cryomancy early on here, because the White Witch is really powerful to combine into. She has freezing effects for your overseers, you have frost arrows for your foreign archers for later, and you have frost blades to power up your melee units. You can splice this really well into, I don't know, Tome of Glades later, or whatever tickles your fancy where you want to get your other ranged units from. It's a really powerful tome, and altogether your culture is extremely powerful at tier 1 domination. I've been playing around with brutal difficulty, and I was always able to, well, pretty much overrun the early free cities in the beginning of the game by just piling up tier 1 units, and after I had like 9 or 10 units by just attacking them, you just sport so much burst damage with these guys. It's really worth mentioning that the Harrier has a pretty nasty bursty attack, the Mercenary has a pretty bursty attack, because that drive back does do 24 damage with just 1 action point left. And it does a lot of extra damage against cavalries and giants. It pierces, so altogether you have so much burst early on. If you picked a trade which allows you to pick a mage lock or an overseer early on as well, on top of that, well, you go places with that. It's really important, though, that you also power play this through, because, like I already mentioned, you fall off quite quickly. You need that domination. You need that early war, because otherwise you won't be able to buy any of these sweet magelock cannons. So you really need to be active on your feet in the very early game, otherwise you will not be too impressive after a couple of turns. But I tested it in Brutal. It really works quite well to build up a pretty sick empire quite quickly. So you have the tools. And the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is I want to point on the Tome of Scrying. Finally, the Tome of Scrying has found a faction that really can use it, because this book has been literally kind of like made for these guys. You have a spell that inflicts marking on a 1 hex radius. And if you use battle mages on top of that, you will also amplify the damage in a sick way. You just gain 20% damage, and if you have mages, even more on that end. Sick spell. Sick debuff. Only for the Reaver, so powerful, but in the hands of this culture, it's amazing. The Watcher gives you a battle mage that you can use. The basic attack isn't too amazing, although it's worth mentioning that it is a Demolisher, but here, Psychic Gaze is the real powerhouse. So, the stun is an opener for your Overseer, marking, and it's in a relatively generous cooldown, has really high range, so these guys are summonable and so massively synergistic again in your Overseer power game, so go for it. Guided projectiles, well, look at this. Supporters, skirmishers, ranged, and this annihilates even more of a chance to miss, so at the end of the day, your units will really hit a lot. And, well, the Tower of True Sight is more of a gimmick, as well as Scry Enemy. These three spells here, they are the real powerhouse, and I totally can recommend it. And, well, that sums up a couple of thoughts that I had when I played around my first 4 or 5 hours with these guys, and I hope it helped you out. Feel free to leave me in the comments your thoughts, your ideas, and what you think I might have missed out or you might want to add in. I'm all ears because, you know, that stuff is quite new, and I'm pretty sure there's way more to play around with these folks. Leave me a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I want to say a big thanks to the supporters of this channel. If you want to join on in, check out Patreon, PayPal, or buy me a coffee, or check out my new channel membership thing, which allows you to preview all the stuff that I upload before it airs. Pretty neat stuff, very, very moderate cost factor, and thanks again for watching this video, for hanging out after the ad roll. I hate to do this, but you know, business is business. I hope you had a nice time. See you all next time.